Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The Vanishing. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Havenwood, tucked away in the rolling hills of the American Midwest. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, and the scent of freshly baked pies wafted from every corner bakery. But there was a chilling air of uncertainty that hung in the air that night, one that would soon unravel the very fabric of their peaceful existence. The story begins with a family, a typical American family. The Mitchells had just moved to Havenwood, escaping the chaos of city life in search of peace and tranquility. They found the perfect house, a charming, weathered old place on the outskirts of town. From the moment they stepped into their new home, they knew something was off. The house had a history, one that few would speak of in hushed tones. It was a crisp fall evening when they first heard the vanishing. It started as a whisper on the wind, barely audible. But soon, it became something they couldn't ignore. The house began to hum, its old wooden floors creaking in rhythm with the eerie sound, as if the house itself was alive, an entity waiting to reveal its darkest secret. One night, the youngest of the Mitchell children, Emily, went missing. She had been playing outside, chasing fireflies in the yard, when suddenly, she vanished. No screams, no cries for help, she simply disappeared, as though the earth had swallowed her whole. The police were called, and a search party was organized. Days turned into weeks, but Emily was never found. Her disappearance puzzled everyone. There were no clues, no sign of struggle. She had just vanished. But as the Mitchells dug deeper into the history of their new home, they began to uncover something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The house had a long and twisted past, one filled with rumors of strange disappearances and unexplainable events that had occurred throughout the years. In fact, it was said that anyone who dared to live in the house for too long would eventually vanish without a trace. As the Mitchells pieced together the puzzle, they uncovered a long-forgotten secret, a curse that had haunted the house for generations. It was said that every 30 years, a child from the family that occupied the house would be taken by an unseen force, a malevolent spirit bound to the property. No one knew why, or how, but the town's elders spoke of strange rituals and unholy bargains made long ago. The Mitchells, desperate to find answers, sought out the oldest resident of Havenwood, Mrs. Cartwright, who had lived in the town her entire life. She was a woman with an unsettling knowledge of the town's secrets, and she seemed to know more about the Mitchell family's history than they did. Mrs. Cartwright led them to an ancient, crumbling church on the outskirts of town, where she revealed the horrifying truth: Emily had been chosen. She was the latest in a long line of children taken by the vanishing force that haunted the house. But there was hope. If they could unravel the mystery of the curse, they could bring her back. With Mrs. Cartwright's guidance, the Mitchells embarked on a perilous journey to uncover the truth behind the vanishing and break the curse once and for all. But as they delved deeper into the history of their home and the town, they began to realize that they were not alone. Something, or someone, was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Each clue they uncovered brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to a fate they could not escape. The vanishing force had a plan, and it was determined to claim every soul that dared to challenge its power. As the Mitchells raced against time, they discovered that the key to breaking the curse lay not in the past, but in the present. They would have to face their greatest fears, confront the darkness that had haunted the town for centuries, and make a sacrifice they were not prepared to make. The clock was ticking. Would they be able to save Emily before the vanishing claimed her and them as its next victims? Or would the curse continue to haunt Havenwood for another 30 years? Chapter 2. The Mitchells sat in the dimly lit parlor, Mrs. Cartwright's words heavy in the air, her voice cracking as she explained the cursed history of the house. Every corner of the room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Emily was gone, swallowed by the darkness that had haunted the house for generations. The silence between them was unbearable. They had come to a crossroads. If they wanted Emily back, they had to find the key to ending the curse. Mrs. Cartwright slowly handed over an old, weathered book she had kept hidden for years, The Vanishing Chronicles. The book's leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. It was clear that many had read it, touched it, and possibly been consumed by it. The book was said to contain knowledge about the dark forces that resided in the house. Mrs. Cartwright, though reluctant, knew the Mitchells were now in too deep to back out. "Read this," Mrs. Cartwright urged. "But be warned, what you learn, you cannot unlearn." James Mitchell, Emily's father, took the book in his hands with a mixture of skepticism and desperation. His heart was in turmoil. He had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering where his little girl had gone. The questions that consumed him were endless. Why her? Why now? Why this house? "Don't be afraid of what you find," Mrs. Cartwright continued. "The vanishing isn't just about loss, it's about a price. A price paid long ago." James opened the book cautiously, scanning the first page. There, etched in ink that looked almost fresh, was the chilling tale of the house's origin. It told of an old family that built the house centuries ago. The family had made a dangerous deal with an ancient entity, a being of shadow and smoke. The entity, in exchange for power and wealth, demanded a price, the soul of a child, taken every 30 years. Over time, the family was replaced by other occupants, but the curse remained, unbroken and relentless. The chilling words sent a shiver down James' spine. He couldn't help but feel that the house itself had been watching him, waiting for the right moment. The idea that Emily had been taken as part of this twisted contract filled him with a rage he hadn't known he had. "Can we break it?" Sarah, Emily's mother, asked, her voice trembling with fear but also hope. "Is there a way to bring her back?" Mrs. Cartwright nodded slowly. "There's always a way, there's always a price to pay. But breaking the curse requires more than just knowledge. It requires a sacrifice, one you might not be willing to make." James felt his heart race. "What kind of sacrifice?" "The one that will save your daughter, but lose something far more precious in return." The room fell silent as the Mitchells absorbed Mrs. Cartwright's words. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was determined. "We'll do anything to get Emily back." Mrs. Cartwright sighed deeply. "The curse requires blood, the sacrifice of one who is pure, one who hasn't been touched by darkness. A willing participant, if you will." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't know if he was ready to face the darkness that lay ahead. But as he looked at Sarah, his wife, he knew there was no other choice. They had to save Emily. "Where do we start?" James asked, his voice resolute despite the fear churning inside him. Mrs. Cartwright stood and walked toward the window, her face shadowed by the dim light of the setting sun. There's a ritual, a binding ceremony that must be performed at the heart of the house. But be warned, the entity does not part easily with its prize. It will fight, and it will use everything in its power to keep what is rightfully its. The Mitchells knew the path ahead would be treacherous. They had heard rumors of strange events that had occurred in Havenwood over the years, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to face. The house, it seemed, had a life of its own, and its dark presence was waiting for them to step inside. The next few days passed in a blur. They gathered everything they would need for the ritual, an old silver knife that had been passed down in Mrs. Cartwright's family for generations, a vial of blood from each of the Mitchells, and a single white candle that had never been lit. The house, eerily silent in the moments before their journey, seemed to hold its breath, as though aware of the impending confrontation. As night fell, the Mitchells made their way to the house. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. They walked silently through the yard, the shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground, as though the night itself was reaching for them. When they entered the house, it felt different, oppressive, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was as if the house had been waiting for them, for this very moment. They made their way to the basement, where the ritual had to be performed. As they descended the creaky staircase, a cold draft filled the air, carrying with it a soft whisper. The walls seemed to shift, moving in unnatural ways, as though the house itself was alive, watching them. At the center of the room stood an altar, a stone table stained with what looked like old blood. The Mitchells had no choice but to place their faith in what they were about to do, even if they didn't fully understand the consequences. James placed the silver knife in the center of the altar, and the Mitchells stood in a circle around it. Mrs. Cartwright began to chant in an ancient language, the words strange and unsettling. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room deepened, as if something was watching them from the corners. Suddenly, the floor trembled beneath them, and the lights flickered. The temperature dropped sharply. The entity had arrived. A low growl echoed through the room, and from the shadows, something stirred. It was massive, a shape formed of darkness, with glowing red eyes that burned like coals. It hovered above the altar, its presence suffocating, filling the room with terror. The Mitchells' hearts pounded in their chests as the entity spoke, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "Do you seek to take what is mine?" it hissed. "You think you can break the deal?" The Mitchells stood firm, the ritual still not complete, as Mrs. Cartwright continued her chant. "We will take back what is ours," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming fear. The entity snarled and lunged at them, its shadowy tendrils reaching out. The house seemed to tremble, the very foundation shaking with the force of its rage. But then, just as it seemed the Mitchells would be consumed by the darkness, a bright flash of light illuminated the room, blinding them all. When the light faded, the entity was gone, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. The Mitchells were left standing in the darkness, breathless, unsure if they had won, or if the battle was just beginning. Emily was still gone, and the vanishing was far from over. Chapter 3. The Mitchells stood in the cold, silent room, still reeling from the otherworldly encounter. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very house itself was holding its breath. The shadows that once lurked in the corners had disappeared, but they could still feel the lingering presence of something dark and malevolent. The entity might have been driven back, but it hadn't been defeated, not yet. Emily's absence weighed heavily on their hearts. Despite the blinding flash of light, nothing had changed. There were no signs of her, no clues left behind. The curse was not broken. If anything, it had only been momentarily halted. The Mitchells had to face the truth. They were only scratching the surface of something far more terrifying than they could ever have imagined. As they gathered themselves, their minds raced with questions. Mrs. Cartwright, who had been eerily calm throughout the ordeal, spoke first. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying tremor to it. "The entity is not gone," she said, her eyes haunted. "It cannot be vanquished by simple rituals. It is part of this house, part of the very land on which it was built. The light we saw was only a temporary warding. The vanishing has only just begun." James and Sarah exchanged a look of helplessness. They had come to Havenwood seeking peace, but now they were caught in the clutches of a nightmare they didn't understand. Their daughter was still gone, and the force that had taken her was only growing stronger. "We have to find a way to break this," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear but full of determination. "We can't let it take her, too." Mrs. Cartwright nodded gravely. "There is only one way to end the curse for good. The book I gave you, The Vanishing Chronicles, contains more than just a history of the house. It contains the truth about what the entity truly is, and what it wants." James clenched his fists. "What does it want?" Mrs. Cartwright hesitated before answering, her face pale. "Power. The entity feeds on fear, on loss. It takes children because they are pure, untainted by the darkness that consumes the rest of us. Emily was chosen because she was the most vulnerable, the most innocent." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had always known that there was something wrong with the house, but he had never imagined that it was feeding off of his family's pain. He could feel his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let this thing take his daughter. Not without a fight. "We need to find out more about it," James said, his voice firm. "The book, where does it lead us?" Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darkened. "It leads to the truth, but it is not a journey for the faint of heart. There are hidden passages in this town, places that no one dares to go. You'll have to follow the clues within the book, but know this, the deeper you go, the more dangerous it will become." Sarah took a deep breath. "We'll do whatever it takes." The Mitchells, with Mrs. Cartwright in tow, set out to explore the dark secrets buried within Havenwood. The book was their only guide, but as they began to decipher its cryptic messages, they quickly realized that the town itself seemed to be changing around them. The once idyllic streets of Havenwood were now distorted, the buildings appearing warped and twisted in ways that defied logic. The trees loomed tall and grotesque, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The wind whispered strange, unintelligible words as it passed by, as though the very air was alive with malevolent intent. They made their way to the heart of the town, where the oldest part of Havenwood stood, a crumbling cemetery hidden behind overgrown weeds and rusted iron gates. It was said to be the resting place of the town's founders, those who had built the cursed house. According to the book, the cemetery held the key to unlocking the entity's true nature. As they approached the gates, a sudden chill filled the air. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the faint sound of distant whispers echoed through the wind. The Mitchells hesitated but pressed on, their determination unwavering. Inside the cemetery, the gravestones were weathered and cracked, their inscriptions long since worn away by time. But one grave stood out among the rest, a tall, jagged stone marked with a symbol they had seen before in the book. It was a dark, twisted sigil, the same one that had been etched into the house's foundation. James reached out to touch the stone, his hand trembling. As soon as his fingers made contact, a wave of energy surged through him, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open. The Mitchells stumbled backward as the earth split, revealing a hidden chamber below. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and awe. Mrs. Cartwright was silent for a moment, her face grim. "This is where it all began," she said softly. "The origins of the curse. The entity is bound here, trapped by the sigil. But it can never truly be defeated, not without unlocking the secrets of the past." They descended into the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that none of them could decipher. The air was thick with dust, and the atmosphere was suffocating. It was clear that no one had entered this place for centuries. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, much like the one in the house's basement, though this one was larger, more imposing. And upon the altar lay an ancient tome, its cover adorned with the same twisted sigil that had marked the gravestone. Mrs. Cartwright approached the altar slowly, reverence in her every step. "This is the book of the original ritual," she explained. "It contains the incantations that were used to summon the entity, and the secret to breaking its hold." James stepped forward, reaching for the book. As his fingers brushed the cover, a violent tremor shook the chamber, and the walls began to close in on them. "We don't have much time," Mrs. Cartwright urged. "We need to find the incantation before it's too late." But as James opened the book, a dark shadow rose from the depths of the chamber. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, growing louder and more frantic. The entity had found them, and it was not pleased. It was time for the Mitchells to face their greatest challenge yet, to confront the very heart of the curse and make the ultimate choice. Chapter 4. The chamber shook violently as the dark shadow swirled around them, its presence suffocating, its form barely visible in the dense, swirling fog. The whispers grew louder, an unholy chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, scratching at the edges of their minds. The Mitchells could feel it, an ancient power that had been dormant for centuries, now awake and furious. James held the book tightly, his knuckles white from the strain. The pages seemed to move on their own, as though the book was eager to reveal its secrets, but the air around them crackled with tension, warning them not to look too deeply. He quickly scanned the pages, his eyes darting over the cryptic symbols and strange words, but they made no sense. His heart pounded in his chest as the shadow seemed to grow larger, its tendrils stretching toward them like a living thing. "Find the incantation!" Mrs. Cartwright yelled, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of the entity. "It's the only way to bind it again." But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet began to crack open, and the temperature plummeted. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the very walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with dark energy. It was as if the entity was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. James's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, desperate to find anything that might save them. The whispers in his mind became louder, more frantic, urging him to give up, to let the darkness consume them all. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, James's eyes landed on the incantation. The words were written in an ancient language, one that he couldn't understand, but the symbols, they felt familiar. He knew, deep down, that this was the key to stopping the entity. "Sarah!" James called out, his voice trembling. "I found it. The incantation, it's here." But before he could begin reading the words aloud, the shadow lunged at them with terrifying speed. The walls of the chamber seemed to collapse inward, the floor splintering beneath their feet. The book in James's hands glowed with a faint, eerie light, but the entity was relentless. It howled, a sound like the scraping of metal on stone, as it tried to engulf them. In a frantic attempt to protect his family, James held the book high, his voice trembling as he began to chant the incantation, his words unsure but filled with desperation. The air crackled, the ground shook violently beneath their feet, and the shadow recoiled for a moment, as though the incantation had struck it. But then, the shadow erupted with fury, its dark tendrils slamming into James, sending him crashing against the stone wall. The book flew from his hands and landed on the ground with a heavy thud. The shadow enveloped him in a suffocating darkness, its whispers growing louder, more frenzied. "James!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking through the chaos. She reached for him, but the darkness held her back, as if the very air was thickening around her. The entity had claimed its first victim. It was only then that James realized the true nature of the curse. It was not just about taking the children, it was about the soul. It wanted them, their very essence, not just their bodies. The entity feasted on their fears, their pain, their loss. It was a predator, and they were nothing but prey. But despite the overwhelming force pressing down on them, James refused to give in. He fought against the darkness, trying to find his way back to the book. Through the haze of shadow and fog, he could still hear the faintest whisper of the incantation echoing in his mind. He reached out, his hand trembling as he picked up the book. His voice broke as he continued the chant, louder this time, more certain. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the shadows recoiled once again, as if something was pushing them back. The air grew thick with a blinding light, and for a moment, everything stopped. The shadow screeched in agony, its form flickering and twisting in the light. The whispers fell silent, and the ground beneath them stabilized. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the light began to fade. The Mitchells found themselves standing in the middle of the chamber once again, but something was different. The entity was gone, at least, for now, but the damage had already been done. James and Sarah stared at each other in shock, their bodies bruised and battered, their hearts heavy with the realization that they had narrowly escaped the entity's grasp. But there was no time to celebrate. Emily was still gone. The vanishing force was not broken. They had only delayed its inevitable return. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around the room. James shook his head. "No, it's not over. The entity is still here. It's part of this place. But we've bought ourselves some time. We have to figure out how to truly end it." Mrs. Cartwright, who had remained eerily calm throughout the entire ordeal, looked at them with sad, knowing eyes. "The entity has been bound, for now. But it will return. And when it does, it will be stronger than ever." They turned to leave the chamber, but as they stepped into the corridor, something stopped them. The ground beneath their feet trembled once more, and the air grew cold again. The house was alive, breathing, waiting. The Mitchells knew they had only just begun to unravel the dark mystery that lay beneath their feet. They had faced the entity once, and they had won, for now. But as they ventured further into the depths of the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And somewhere, deep within the house, Emily's voice echoed, faint but clear. "Help me." Chapter 5. The air in the house felt heavier now, thick with the remnants of the entity's malevolent presence. The Mitchells, battered and bruised but not broken, trudged forward, each step weighed down by the haunting thought that they were not safe yet. Emily's voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed in the back of their minds, spurring them forward as if she were calling them from the depths of the house. They could hear it too, the quiet desperation in her voice, a chilling reminder that time was running out. But the house was not the same. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the very building was alive, watching, waiting. The shadows stretched unnaturally long in the dimly lit hallways, flickering like dark flames. The once familiar rooms now felt alien, each one distorted by a presence far darker than they had ever imagined. "Where is she?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear as she reached for James's hand. "Emily, we have to find her." "We will," James replied, his voice hard with determination. "We have to keep moving. We're close, I can feel it." But even as the words left his lips, doubt crept into his mind. The house seemed to be shifting around them, as if the very structure itself were conspiring against them. Each door they opened led them to another twisted version of a room they had already passed. The windows, once clear, were now clouded and distorted, as though they had been transported to another world altogether. Mrs. Cartwright, who had been strangely quiet since their escape from the chamber, stopped suddenly in the middle of the hall. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something you need to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house doesn't just take, it traps." James frowned, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "We've seen the entity, whatever it is. It wants to take Emily, but we've stopped it, for now." Mrs. Cartwright shook her head. "No, it's not that simple. The house, it creates illusions. It feeds on your deepest fears. The longer you stay, the more it twists your perception." Emily's voice? "It's not really her. It's the house, using her memory to lure you deeper." A chill ran down James's spine as the implications of her words sank in. The house had been manipulating them this entire time, feeding off their fear and desperation. Emily's voice had been a trap, one they had walked right into. The realization hit hard. They weren't just fighting the entity, they were fighting the house itself. "We have to stop it," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't let it win. We'll find a way to bring her back. We will bring her back." James turned to face her, his expression dark with resolve. "We're going to end this, once and for all." But just as he said the words, the house seemed to respond. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though something or someone was stalking them. Mrs. Cartwright's face paled even further. "We need to move. Now." They turned, ready to make their way toward the stairs, when the floor beneath their feet groaned. The walls closed in, the shadows darkening, as the whispers started again, only this time, they were more distinct. The voices didn't come from the air, they came from within the house, from the walls themselves, from the floorboards, from the very foundation. They were everywhere, their words twisted and distorted. "You should have left. You can't escape." The house began to shift, the walls contracting and expanding, as though it was alive, feeding on their fear. Each room they passed seemed to distort, growing darker, more sinister. The windows now displayed images of Emily, her face twisted in anguish, reaching out with hands that didn't belong to her. She's gone. She's not the same. James's heart stopped as he saw his daughter's face on the wall, her eyes pleading, her voice a hollow whisper. Daddy, help me, please. But Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the wall, away from the illusion. Don't listen to it. It's not her. James nodded, but the image was burned into his mind. The house was toying with them, using their deepest fears to weaken their resolve. But they couldn't afford to fall for it. Not now. They pushed forward, heading toward the basement again, where they knew the heart of the house lay. The entity had been bound in that chamber, but they had to find a way to truly defeat it. But the closer they got, the more intense the whispers became, each one filled with malice, each one pulling at their sanity. As they reached the basement door, a sudden loud bang shook the house, and the door burst open by itself, revealing the dark expanse of the room. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The altar in the center of the room stood as it had before, but now it seemed different, darker, more ominous, as if it had been waiting for them. Mrs. Cartwright stepped forward, her expression grim. This is it. The place where it all began. This is where we must break the curse. James turned to her, his face pale but determined. How do we do it? What's the final step? Mrs. Cartwright nodded, her face drawn. The sigil, the one on the book, the one that binds the entity to the house. We need to destroy it, erase it from this place. If we don't, it will keep coming back, over and over. Sarah stepped forward, her voice filled with dread. And how do we destroy it? Mrs. Cartwright held out a strange, intricately carved dagger, its blade gleaming in the low light. We must cut it from the walls. The sigil was carved into the very foundation of the house. It's a part of the land itself. We destroy it, and the entity will no longer have power here. James took the dagger, feeling its weight in his hand. It was heavier than it looked, as if it carried the weight of the curse with it. He turned to Sarah, whose eyes were filled with fear, but also with a glimmer of hope. They were close now. So close. Without another word, James moved to the wall. The sigil marked in ancient, twisted symbols. As he raised the dagger, the house seemed to react, the walls groaning and creaking as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but James pushed forward, the dagger carving into the stone. But the moment the first cut was made, the ground trembled, and the shadows in the room shifted. The entity was angry. The walls closed in, the room growing darker by the second, as if the house itself were trying to swallow them whole. The sigil was only part of the puzzle. Now, they needed to confront the very source of the house's power. The Mitchells were standing at the edge of something far darker than they had ever imagined. Their final choice would determine whether they would leave this nightmare alive, or become part of the house's twisted legacy. Chapter 6. The sigil on the wall was slowly coming undone, each cut of the dagger leaving jagged marks in the stone. But as James continued to carve, the house around him seemed to retaliate. The floor trembled, and the walls groaned in agony, like a dying beast fighting for its last breath. Every stroke of the dagger seemed to make the whispers louder, more desperate, like the house was trying to stop them from finishing what they had started. "Keep going!" Sarah shouted over the cacophony, her voice barely audible over the rising noise. She grabbed James's arm and pulled him back for a moment, her face pale. "We can't stop now." "Emily." "I know," James replied through gritted teeth, his hand shaking as he lifted the dagger again. The sigil was almost completely erased, but something was off. The air had become thick, and the shadows in the room seemed to be moving of their own accord, swirling and undulating as though they were alive. But before James could continue, a loud crash echoed from behind them, and the door to the basement slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. The room grew darker still, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah's breath became visible in the freezing air. "No," Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice low and strained. "We've triggered something. The house is trying to keep us trapped. It knows what we're doing." James's heart raced as he looked around the room. The shadows had grown longer, twisting and curling into shapes that didn't belong in this world. The air felt alive with dark energy, pressing in from all sides, suffocating them. The whispers had become a chorus of voices, chanting in an ancient language that James couldn't understand, but it was unmistakably a warning. "We have to finish this," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "We can't give up now." Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a shape in the far corner of the room. It was vague at first, but as the darkness thickened, it took form, a figure cloaked in black, its face hidden in shadow. The air around them crackled, and the temperature dropped even further. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the figure as it slowly stepped toward them. "It's here," Sarah whispered, fear rising in her voice. "The entity, it's not done yet." Mrs. Cartwright's face went pale, and for the first time since they had met her, she looked truly afraid. "We've made a mistake. The sigil, it's not just a binding. It's a doorway. A trap. If you destroy it, you release something far worse." The figure in the shadows stepped forward, its presence filling the room. It was massive, far larger than any man, and as it moved, the floor seemed to shake beneath its weight. Its eyes gleamed red, piercing through the darkness, locking onto James and Sarah with an intensity that made their skin crawl. "You should not have come," the voice boomed, deep and unearthly. It was as if the house itself was speaking, its voice emanating from the very walls. James's grip tightened on the dagger. He glanced at Sarah, and without a word, they both understood there was no turning back. The entity had been playing them all along. The house was a prison, and they were merely its latest victims. "We will stop you," James shouted, his voice rising in defiance. He lunged forward, slashing the dagger through the air, and the sigil on the wall cracked, breaking apart like shattered glass. The room exploded in a flash of blinding light, and the ground trembled with such force that the Mitchells were thrown to the floor. The figure in the corner screeched, its voice a sound like nails on a chalkboard, as the shadows surged toward the sigil. The wall seemed to collapse inward, the very foundation of the house shaking with a violent force. For a moment, everything went black. When James opened his eyes, the room was eerily still. The tremors had stopped, and the shadows had vanished. The house was silent. He sat up slowly, his body sore from the impact, and looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sarah," he called out, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. His eyes scanned the room, searching for her. And then, to his relief, he saw her. She was standing by the altar, staring at something in the corner of the room. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide with terror. "James," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's gone. It's over." He stood up, rushing over to her, but as he approached, he saw what she was looking at. The altar, which had once been covered in ancient symbols, was now completely empty. The sigil was gone, and the walls, though still worn and aged, no longer pulsed with dark energy. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house seemed at peace. But then, a chill ran down his spine. In the far corner of the room, Emily stood. She was motionless, her back to them. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes torn. At first, James thought it was a hallucination, an illusion created by the house to deceive them. But the figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was unmistakably his daughter's, though it was distorted. Her eyes were wide, dark, and vacant, empty, like two hollow voids staring into the abyss. "Emily?" James whispered, his voice trembling with hope. But the girl didn't speak. She merely tilted her head, her movements slow and unnatural. She reached out her hand toward him, her fingers trembling as if trying to make contact, but there was no warmth, no life behind her actions. And then, the voice came. "Help me, Daddy." It was Emily's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably hers. James stepped forward, heart pounding in his chest. "Emily, what happened to you? Where have you been?" But as he reached for her, she stepped backward, her form flickering, like an image on a broken television. The room around them began to distort again, the shadows creeping in as the walls seemed to stretch. The floor trembled beneath their feet once more. And then, in an instant, Emily's face twisted into something horrific. Her features shifted into a grotesque mask of horror, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth stretching into a silent scream. The house was not done with them yet. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. "Help me, Daddy, it's not over, it's never over." The walls around them shook violently as the house's true nature was revealed. The Mitchells had not escaped. They had only unlocked the final door. The vanishing was not just a curse, it was a cycle. And this time, the house would not release them. Chapter 7. The house seemed to pulse with an ominous rhythm, as if it had come alive once more. The walls trembled with a low growl, the floor beneath them creaking as though the very foundation of the house was shifting. The Mitchells stood frozen, their hearts hammering in their chests, as the figure of Emily flickered before them, twisting and distorting into a nightmare they couldn't escape. "Emily," James whispered, but the words caught in his throat as the twisted form of his daughter began to move toward him, her face now contorted into something unnatural. Her eyes, empty, hollow voids, glared at him with a chilling emptiness, and her mouth opened in a silent scream, the darkness inside her seeming to grow with each passing second. Sarah reached for James, her voice trembling. "It's not her, it's the house, James. It's using her to lure us in." The walls around them closed in, the shadows growing longer and darker. The house was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every second they hesitated. The whispers, maddening and insistent, echoed from every corner, urging them to give in. "Daddy, help me." The words were a distorted echo of Emily's voice, but they were far from comforting. They were a command, an invitation to step into the abyss, to join the endless cycle of the vanishing. James could feel the pull of the house, the weight of the curse, dragging him toward the darkness. "No," James said firmly, shaking his head. "We're not going to fall for this. We've come this far. We're getting out of here." But as he said the words, the house responded. The door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the temperature dropped, the air thickening as if the house itself were breathing. The floor beneath them began to tremble once again, and the shadows that filled the room seemed to grow in strength. The walls around them twisted, the hallway stretching and contorting like a labyrinth with no escape. The house was reshaping itself, adapting to their every move. They were trapped. "We need to get out," Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the house. The whispers, once soft, had turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Words they couldn't understand, words filled with a terrible promise. The lights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. Then, a piercing sound filled the air, an eerie wail that seemed to come from the very walls themselves, a sound that made their blood run cold. The room around them shifted again, and they found themselves in a completely different place. They were no longer in the basement, but standing in a long, dark corridor. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time. The air was thick with dust, and the temperature had dropped even further. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words now clear. "You cannot escape." The voice was no longer a distant whisper. It was all around them, suffocating them. The house was speaking to them, mocking them. The curse had claimed them. There was no way out. Sarah's face was pale with fear. "It's happening again, isn't it? The house, it's taking us." "We won't let it," James said, his voice filled with desperation. "We're not giving up." But as he said those words, the corridor ahead of them began to twist and distort, the shadows moving like liquid, forming into shapes that didn't belong. The walls shifted, and suddenly, they found themselves in a room they had never seen before, a vast, dark chamber, the size of a cathedral. The walls were covered in dark, shifting symbols, the air thick with an oppressive energy. And in the center of the room stood the altar, the same altar from the basement, only now it was surrounded by a swirling vortex of darkness. The room seemed to pulse with an ancient power, and James could feel the pull of the vortex, dragging him toward it. He turned to Sarah. "We have to destroy the sigil, destroy it all." But as he moved toward the altar, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, and from the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were twisted, nightmarish versions of people who had lived in the house before them, their faces twisted in terror, their eyes empty. "They're all here," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "They've all vanished into this place." The figures began to move toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped in this place, just like the others who had vanished before them. James could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the presence of the lost souls surrounding them. They were prisoners of the house, cursed to remain in the shadows, forever trapped in the cycle of the vanishing. But there was no time to waste. The sigil still had to be destroyed, and the house was growing stronger with each passing moment. The dark figure of Emily stood at the edge of the room, her hollow eyes locked on James, her face twisted in a silent scream. "Daddy, help me!" The words were soft, faint, but they carried an unbearable weight. James felt his heart break as he looked at her, his daughter, who had been lost to the house, who had become a part of the curse. He knew he couldn't save her, not in the way he had hoped. The house had taken her, and now it was using her to keep him trapped here. With a final, desperate cry, James rushed toward the altar. He didn't know if it would work, but he had no other choice. He had to destroy the sigil, had to break the cycle, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He raised the dagger high and plunged it into the altar. The room trembled, and the vortex of darkness exploded outward in a flash of blinding light. The Mitchells woke up to a silence they hadn't known for what seemed like an eternity. The house was gone. The altar was gone. The walls, the twisted symbols, the shifting shadows, they were all gone. The house had collapsed in on itself, as if it had never existed. The air was fresh, and the world outside felt new, untouched. The darkness was gone, and with it, the curse. But as they stood in the clearing where the house had once stood, they realized that Emily was still gone. The house might have been destroyed, but the price had been paid. The vanishing had claimed its final victim. And yet, as they stood there, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint voice. "Help me!" It was Emily's voice, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't desperate. It was calm, as if it had finally found peace. The Mitchells knew they could never return to the house, but they also knew that the cycle of the vanishing was over. The curse had been broken, and though they had lost much, they had won their freedom. For now. Final chapter. The Mitchells stood in the clearing, staring at the place where the house had once stood. The sky above them was clear, the air crisp, and the world seemed impossibly still. The oppressive weight that had haunted them for so long had finally lifted, but the emptiness in their hearts remained. Emily was still gone. James and Sarah stood together, their hands tightly clasped, as if the bond between them was the only thing that had kept them grounded through the horrors they had endured. Their journey had come to an end, but the price had been steep. In the distance, the forest was silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. The house, no, the prison that had held them captive, was nothing more than rubble now. There were no signs of life, no trace of the nightmare they had endured. But as they stood there, a voice reached out from the silence. It was faint at first, carried by the wind. "Daddy. Mommy." It was Emily's voice. James and Sarah's hearts stopped, and for a moment, they wondered if they had finally broken. If the darkness had tricked them once more. They turned toward the sound, but there was no sign of their daughter, just the quiet stillness of the forest. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched James's arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I heard it." The voice echoed again, this time closer, but still faint, as though it was coming from the very earth itself. "Daddy, help me!" James's chest tightened as he felt the pull of the voice, the echo of their lost daughter calling to them. He took a step forward, but Sarah gripped his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "No, James," she said, her voice shaking. "We've lost enough. We've fought this darkness for too long. We can't go back." "But it's Emily," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. He felt an undeniable pull toward the sound, as if something deep inside him was guiding him toward it. His heart ached with the longing to hear his daughter's voice again, to see her, to hold her. "You don't know if it's really her," Sarah said softly. "It could be the house, the curse, trying to draw us in again. Please, James, we can't fall for it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the wind whispering around them, carrying the faintest trace of Emily's voice. It was so real, so close. But James felt the truth settling in his chest. They had come so far. They had broken the cycle. The house was gone. Emily was gone. And yet, the voice came again, louder this time. Daddy. The sound filled the space between them, a soft, almost tender whisper in the wind. Sarah's expression softened as she looked at James, seeing the struggle in his eyes. She knew how badly he wanted to believe. She had wanted to believe too. But they couldn't let this darkness consume them again. James, Sarah said, her voice firm but gentle. Let her go. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and love. James felt the weight of them in his chest. He had been holding on to the hope that Emily could be returned to him, but in the depths of his soul, he knew she was gone. The house had taken her, and no matter how much he wished otherwise, she would never be the same. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the weight of his loss settling in his bones. I'm so sorry, Emily, he whispered. I love you. The wind shifted, the voice fading into the distance, leaving only silence in its wake. Sarah's arms wrapped around him, pulling him close. They stood there together, in the stillness of the forest, grieving their daughter, but also knowing they had survived. They had broken the curse, and now it was time to move on, to live without the shadow of the house hanging over them. They had paid the price, and they would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. But they were free. The house was gone, the vanishing broken. They could finally live without fear. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the clearing, James and Sarah turned and began to walk away. The path ahead of them was uncertain, but together they would face it. They would rebuild. They would heal. And perhaps, one day, they would find peace. The end. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.